If you've seen a few macros and if you've heard about how the recording process is the best way to create a macro, let's actually do that using this workbook called Introduction. And let's imagine we're on the Formulas tab. And what we'd like to be able to do is to record a macro that highlights the number cells, the cells that have just pure numbers, like this one and that one. As we look in the formula bar here, we're not seeing any formulas. Let's say we don't want to highlight the formula cells. That's pretty quickly done from the Home tab. You can click a single cell, rightmost button, find and select, choose formulas, they're highlighted. But we want to do that for number cells and apply a color as well. And again, we would only do this because we've identified this as a need. We need it frequently. And for the moment, we're only going to be using it in this workbook, but eventually we might be thinking we could use this in other workbooks as well. Sometimes you'll record a macro thinking only of the current workbook, and later you'll change your mind. And we'll show you throughout this course how you can move macros into different locations so as to make them available for different workbooks. So let's imagine we've identified this process. I'm going to go through it manually once just to point out how easily it is. Begin by clicking a single cell in this worksheet. We are about to highlight just the number cells in here and apply a color to them. We want to know at a glance where the pure numbers are. We'll do a similar thing possibly with the formulas that we already showed you, but this is a feature that we need frequently, and it involves about 10 steps. Let's simply have a macro available, make it be one click, one keystroke shortcut, or maybe a new button up in the quick access toolbar. So manually, to highlight all the number cells, click a single cell, make sure the Home tab is visible in the ribbon menu system. Far right button, find and select, choose Go to Special, and then choose Constants, but don't check Text, Logicals, and Errors. In other words, uncheck those three boxes. At first, this looks a little strange. These boxes can apply to formulas, but they can also apply to constants. Click OK. We've highlighted just the number cells. The other cells where you see numbers contain formulas. Let's also apply a color here. So on the Home tab from the Fill Color bucket right here, let's choose a color. You want to choose a light color. And if we're going to be using a different color for formulas, maybe you've thought that out ahead of time. I'll just use a light blue here. There we are. We've highlighted all the cells that contain numbers and they're blue. And to make this more obvious, because they are currently highlighted as well, we can't see the color quite as clearly. I'm going to click in cell A1. Not truly critical, but it's going to look more obvious as we do this. I'll click cell A1. Now, let's say we start to do that frequently. We need it often, not only in this worksheet, but others. And we've identified that as a need. Why go through those 8 or 10 steps, whatever it is? How about a single click, single shortcut, keystroke shortcut, new button? Let's make this fast. So we've identified the process. Let's turn on the macro recorder, the dominant method for recording macros. And I would say for many Excel users, really the only method, although you might later copy some code into macros, do some other things with the Visual Basic language. But let's say the recording process is what macro creation is really all about. So I'm going to manually take off the color here. I'll simply undo my last action, Control Z. We've identified the need. We click on a single cell. Let's turn on the recording process. So how do we do this? One of three ways. First of all, in the lower left-hand corner, you'll see the word ready. You might or might not be seeing an icon to the right of it. This is in the lower left corner in the status bar. If you do have the button there and slide over it, you get a message saying no macros are currently recording. Click to begin recording a new macro. We could certainly start right there. If you do not see this button, right-click in an empty space in the status bar and click the macro recording entry. That will apply the check, and then you will see that button down there. So we might have to do that. Another way to start the recording process is to go to the View tab in the ribbon. And off to the right, you'll see a button called Macros. Don't click the button. Click the arrow below it right there. And there's the choice, Record Macro. In the description, each of the commands you perform will be saved into the macro so that you can play them back again. And by the way, the term playback is frequently used, as well as run or execute. So later when we want to use the macro, we play it back, we run it, we execute it. A third way to get to the recording process is to activate what's called the Developer tab. You might not be seeing this on your screen, and if you're not, simply right-click any other existing tab and choose Customize the Ribbon. And in the Excel Options dialog box, down on the right-hand side, you'll see a box for Developer. So if it's not present, you want to click that box so the check mark is visible and click OK. And the Developer tab, then if you click on it, you will see off to the left, Record Macro. And once we start the process of recording, this will then change into Stop Macro. So we can use the Developer tab. We can also use the View tab. We can also use the button in the lower left-hand corner. And throughout this course, at different times, we'll be using different ways of starting the recording process. Let's say here that we are ready. We've either written down those steps or we know them. So active cell is on a single cell. Let's turn on the recording process. This time I'll start with the View tab. Click the drop arrow under Macros. Record Macro. In this dialog box, you're going to be prompted with a macro name. It'll say macro 1, 2, 3, something like that. You can put in any name you want here. It's suggested that you make this meaningful, describe what the macro is going to do. You cannot have spaces in the macro name. It cannot begin with a number. So for example here, how about highlight number cells? Now you can't put in a space, but you can use underscore or you can shift from upper and lower case to simulate the look of separate words. Highlight number cells. You've got up to 255 characters as you're typing this. Shortcut key is not required, but it's handy. You can use any of the lowercase letters, any of the uppercase letters, and there's more about that in subsequent movies as to what you can use. If you use Control N here, you will not be able to use Control N anymore for opening or creating a new workbook. If you use Control C, I think you wouldn't, but if you did, you could not use Control C for copy. So a lot of people just hold down the Shift key and use one of the uppercase letters. There aren't too many existing Excel combinations that use Control and Shift and letter. So you do have the option of using those lowercase letters, but I think you want to be careful not to inhibit some frequently used options that you might already be using. I'm going to hold down the Shift key here and press the letter N. There we are. Again, I stress it's not required that you use this. You also have the option later of changing this or removing it, or if you didn't add it now, you could add it later. For the moment, let's say we want to store the macro in this workbook. We'll talk about other options later, but it makes sense for the moment to simply say the macro will be associated with this workbook. That's where we're going to store it. The description of the macro, this is not required, but it is recommended. Later, as you encounter more and more macros, it's really handy if a description at the beginning of the macro, which we'll see later, describes what the macro does, perhaps in more detail than just the name. What I often do is start with the name. I'll simply highlight it, press Control C, click down the description panel, paste with Control V, maybe make the changes. Here we can use spaces if we wish. Maybe I'll expand this just a little bit to indicate that when we use this macro, it only applies to the current worksheet. Now, we're about to click OK, and the idea here is to stay focused. Anything we do while recording will get created and stored in the macro, and later that will happen as we play back the macro. The one exception to that is if you go into a dialog box, perhaps by mistake, and you simply cancel it, that action will not be recorded. So let's click OK. Now, let's say I forgot that for the moment. I scroll up and down just to see what this looks like. That's going to be in the macro. It's innocuous, it won't take up any time, but we'll just get rid of it. But the idea is stay focused, do what we need to do. What do we need to do here? Home tab, far right button, find and select. Go to special, like we did before manually. Choose constants, uncheck the boxes for text, logicals, and errors. Click OK. We've highlighted the number cells. Let's go to the Home tab, click the drop arrow for the bucket, choose the color we want here, say that one. And then, although not critical, let's just click in a different cell to unhighlight these, but keep the color. I'm clicking on cell A1. We're done. I could go back to the View tab or the Developer tab to stop the macro, or I can go down to the lower left corner, click that box. Click to stop recording. The macro has been recorded. Let's test it. Go to a different sheet, like profits. Click anywhere here. Let's try this macro. The keystroke shortcut, Control-Shift-N. There it is. The macro ran. It's handy. We'll try it elsewhere too, perhaps. Eventually, we might make this macro be available to other workbooks as well. We'll talk about that in later movies. A relatively straightforward process here of remembering the steps that we need in the macro. We turn on the recorder, we record those steps. In the future, we can get to those steps instantly, a single action with a keystroke shortcut here. There's no question this is going to be a time saver if we need to use those steps frequently.